I felt something bothering Paula as soon as she stepped over the threshold. That's what you gain after nearly 20 years of marriage.
Is so meeting wrong, Paula?
I asked, watching her fuss about preparing dinner. No, nothing at all, she replied, perhaps a bit too hastily. One thing I've learned during my time with Paula is that you can't make her open up about something until she wants to. Pressing her would be a futile waste of time at best, or lead to an argument at worst. So I set the table and kept my mouth shut. Tomorrow evening, I need to go back to work briefly around 7 o'clock, Bill, Paula informed me. I need to meet with some parents to discuss the lack of progress their children are making. No problem, I replied, recalling a conversation with Tim Brown earlier that day. Tim was the head technician at the middle school where Paula taught. He was in my body shop getting an estimate for repairing a dent in his fender from a too-close encounter with a deer. He explained how absurd it would be, in his opinion, to evacuate the entire school tomorrow evening while some special guys from Hazmat remove about 4 inches of asbestos insulation found on the heating pipe in the bus garage. The garage was nearly 100 yards away from the school building, but those in power didn't want any trouble arising from removing hazardous materials, so the decision was made to evacuate the school, including the night security staff. And now Paula tells me she has a meeting at the school for that evening. It didn't make any sense. Paula never lied about anything, especially trivial matters. And then it dawned on me, this might not be trivial at all. Where was she really going, and why? Why did she feel the need to lie? I pondered this over dinner and much later. Eventually, I made a decision and focused all my attention on spending the rest of the evening with my wife and our 2 teenage daughters. The next day, I invited my new employee, Steve Milko, into my office and explained what I wanted from him. Just follow Paula and see where she goes and who she meets, Steve. She hasn't met you yet, so she has no reason to suspect you. I know this isn't part of your job description, but it would be a favor to me, and I'll pay you overtime for the time you actually spend on it, I added. That settles it, boss, Steve grinned. I'll easily recognize your wife from the photo with your kids. I'll track her and give you a full report tomorrow morning. I didn't like what I was doing, but I felt like I had no choice.
Paula lied to me.
I had to know why. In all the years I'd been with her, I'd never once suspected her of lying. Now those years of trust were shattered. Well, boss, last night I did a pretty good job, but you won't like what I found out, Steve began, settling into the chair in front of my desk. Your wife met some guy at the Dewdrop Inn. They sat at a table in the far corner, got a couple of mugs of beer, and sat down nearby.
And wo's wie, Steve?
I demanded an answer. I thought you understood this was delicate business and that I didn't want the whole town to know about it. Boss, how long have you been married? I can't just get up and leave at any time of day or night without telling my wife where I'm going and what I'm doing.
If I try to lie to her, she'll catch on, and then I'm in hot water.
Once Marcy heard about my task, she wasn't going to let it go. It worked out well because she hears better than I do, and she's smarter than me, although I'll never admit it to her, Steve confessed. Keep going, Steve, I replied shortly. When I sat down, I noticed that the guy had some old magazines on his table. I couldn't tell what kind of magazines they were, but I know what was in them, Steve continued. This guy was blackmailing your wife, boss. He told her he'd show some photos in the magazine to you and your kids, and even send some to your wife's boss if she didn't cooperate. How much money did he ask from her? What were those photos? How much time did he give her?
I quickly asked.
What did Paula say to him? Right now, boss, remember, I'm just reporting.
Don't shoot the messenger, okay?
Steve replied. He told her he wanted her to be his lover and gave her until Monday to decide. Your wife begged him to take the money, but he just laughed at the offer. With all due respect, boss, he told her he wanted to be with her whenever he felt like it. There were no options. I had to hold Marcy back from getting up and smashing a beer bottle over his head. She was so angry. I pondered over what Steve had told me. It was easy to thwart blackmail, all that was needed was the truth. What truth could be so terrible that Paula would even consider such a despicable offer?
Who was this unfortunate man?
I suppose you didn't catch the name of this guy? I asked hopefully. Boss, we found out his name.
It's Tom.
That's what your wife called him, Steve replied. That rules out Sid and Harry, but there are plenty of guys named Tom around here, I muttered. Can you describe what he looked like? A smile slowly crept onto Steve's face as he heard my question. I told you, Marcy is much smarter than me, boss. Before they interrupted their little meeting, Marcy came up with a brilliant idea. I stand up so she can take a picture of me on her phone, but at the last second she snapped a picture of that guy sitting with your wife instead. Here it is, Steve grinned, pulling out his phone from his pocket, tapping a few buttons and handing it to me. There's the dude. The photo wasn't the best, but I immediately recognized the man. It was Thomas Mann, an educator since 2000, recently appointed as the deputy principal of the high school where Paula worked. He almost didn't get the position because Paula complained about what she deemed inappropriate behavior between Mann and a girl. Then he told Paula in private that she would regret her actions. Obviously, he was trying to fulfill his promise. There were many questions. Why the old magazines? How would Paula react to this? Would she come to me for help? Would she give in? I knew the answer to the last question, only through me. It was Thursday morning. I had a few days to think over the situation and try to find a good solution. If need be, I'd visit this guy on Monday and put an end to his dreams of sleeping with my wife, or any other woman. It just seemed to me that risking being arrested was a bad idea. That evening, Paula was quiet. Even our daughters noticed and asked her if anything was wrong. Paula gave some unconvincing excuse about pondering new ideas for the literature course she was teaching. Somehow, the girls bought it. That night, lying in bed, she rested her head on my shoulder and, holding me tightly, confessed her endless love. What was happening made her fear she might lose me. That I saw very clearly. The next day, as soon as I returned home, there was a knock on the front door. My eldest daughter, Chris, opened it and called me. It was a courier with a package for me and another one for my daughters. For Lisa, by the time I signed, Chris had already opened the package and was digging through its contents. These are old magazine photos of women, and one of them is Mom. Chris exclaimed. Let me see. Lisa insisted, snatching pages from her sister's hands. Wow, that's Mom, and she's showing everything. Look how young she is. She was beautiful. Chris gasped, peeking over her sister's shoulder. Dad, when did Mom take these pictures? Why has she never shown them to us? Why did we receive them in some postal package? Your mother will be back soon. You should ask her these questions. And now, let's sit down calmly, look at all this, and discuss what we think about it, I suggested. 20 minutes later, Paula entered the front door with a sigh. It seemed like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Then she noticed the three of us sitting on the couch with photos spread out on the coffee table. Oh no, that's all she could manage to squeeze out when the realization of what we were looking at hit her. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Mom, come over here and look at these photos we recently got, Chris insisted. You never told us about this, and we're all really upset. I'm so sorry, Chris. Those awful photos were a huge mistake I made many years ago. You weren't supposed to see them, Paula exclaimed, visibly distraught. Mom, you're so beautiful. We're upset that you never told us about them and never showed them to us. We want to make copies and hang them on the wall. I can't wait to show my friends what my mom looked like. Chris exclaimed. Yeah, Mom. Dad says you were even more beautiful in real life than in these photos. Why didn't you tell us about them? Mom, you're so cool. Lisa giggled, running up to her mother and hugging her. Paula was clearly stunned for the second time in the last few minutes. Her tears stopped flowing as her daughters showered her with love and compliments. She turned her attention to me. Darling, you're still beautiful, I told her, rising and approaching her. Actually, you look even more attractive today than you did many years ago, and that says a lot. I hugged her and held her close. She buried her face in my chest and sniffled a bit before looking up at me. You don't hate me, do you, Bill? Paula whispered. Do you still love me? More than ever, darling, I laughed and kissed her deeply. Now that we're done with all this nonsense, Mom, come here and tell us all about these photos, Chris insisted. We're dying to hear the story behind these magazine shots. Were you a model or something? My father passed away when I was in my freshman year, remember? I told you about it, girls. I've already told you that during my first 3 years in college, I supported myself. My mother didn't have much money left. Yes, I posed for photographers who sent photos to those magazines and calendars that men like to look at. They weren't exactly respectable family magazines, but they weren't truly bad either, Paula quickly added. Posing and working as a waitress on weekends, I largely paid for my college. At the end of my sophomore year, an uncle I had never met died and left me over $10,000. I was able to stop posing. I worked as a waitress and finished college the following year, Paula concluded. Why didn't you ever tell us about this? Why didn't you show us the photos, Mom? Chris asked. You look stunning. I hope in a couple of years I'll have a figure like yours. I guess it's obvious, Chris. I'm not proud of what I did. I feel like I betrayed you kids and your father, even though I didn't know him at the time, and you two certainly weren't born yet, Paula explained. I was determined to get my degree and a decent job, whatever it took. It turns out I jeopardized my future by being so determined. I lived in fear that your father would someday find out the truth and leave me. I wouldn't blame him if he did. You seem to not know much about Dad, Lisa chuckled. He couldn't tear his eyes away from those photos and told us how amazing you were. He said we should be proud to have such a beautiful and smart mom.
He said that? Paula exclaimed.
All these years I've been worried about him finding out. Mom. Both girls squealed in unison.
Sorry, girls. Bill, will you help me unzip my dress?
Paula asked, taking my hand and heading to the bedroom. Don't forget about our dinner. Chris called out, clearly not fooled by the zipper excuse. The next day was Saturday. I called Steve's wife, Marcy, and asked if she'd accompany me to meet with the school principal, Mrs. Gwen Wilder. When I explained what it was about, she jumped at the chance. Then I called Mrs. Wilder at home and arranged to meet in the afternoon, explaining that it was extremely important. The three of us sat around the large table in Mrs. Wilder's office. I pulled out the package and placed it on the table. Mrs. Wilder, I want you to look at these photos and then listen to a little drama that Marcy overheard, I began. When you print them out, you'll see that these are old magazine photos of my wife, Paula, and she has a beautiful figure, Marcy exclaimed, flipping through the stack. I'd love to meet your wife, she's just stunning. It strikes me as odd that you brought this to my attention, Bill. Paula has an excellent reputation at our school. Her work was outstanding, and she received nothing but commendations. Why risk showing me these photos at all? Mrs. Gwen Wilder inquired. Because they exist, Mrs. Wilder. That means they could be used against her at some point in the future, and I fear that future may be imminent, I added. Paula helped pay for college by posing for these magazines. She's not particularly proud of them.
They are what they are.
You can decide if they violate any terms of her contract. She wants to continue working at your school, but won't apologize or beg to keep her job, I stated firmly. Now Marcy will tell you what she overheard and is ready to testify under oath. Monday morning arrived, and Paula was visibly agitated. This person is expecting my answer today, Bill. I told you about the deadline. I don't understand why he sent the photos to you and the girls before that. Perhaps he thinks my fear of being fired will be enough to make me comply with his demands, Paula mused.
Probably so, Paula, I agreed.
However, he would know that you'd ask me who sent these photos, and I will tell you. It seems this would expose him to some risk and reduce the likelihood of me agreeing to his proposal, she reasoned. Who knows what this madman is thinking, Paula?
I asked.
Don't try to understand a sick mind. You're probably right, but it seems strange to me, Paula continued.
I wonder if he'll find a job after today.
Well, there's only one way to find out.
I love you, Bill.
Thanks for understanding and forgiving. I hugged Paula tightly, kissed her, and opened the door for her. Paula was working with several students on the school play script she directed every year. Today's classes were over, and the school was nearly empty. I stood behind the stage curtains and simply observed.
About 15 Minuten into the rehearsal, Mr. Thomas Mann burst through the door, cursing like a madman.
His anger was directed at Paula. You. I got fired because of you. I have enough sense to knock some respect into you. You're just terrible, he shouted, advancing towards Paula with a clenched fist. Unfortunately for him, I was prepared for something like this and stood in front of Paula before he could reach her. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the students scattering in horror. It worked perfectly for my purposes. Mann's surprise was complete. Then Mrs. Wilder stormed onto the stage with school security and abruptly halted, looking first at Mann then at me. She simply nodded, then she instructed her guard to call the police and an ambulance. After they wheeled Mann out on a stretcher, cursing like an old sailor, Paula pulled me aside.
Don't treat me like a fool, Bill, she began.
Too many things don't add up in this chaos. You seem to know what to expect before it happened, and nothing surprised you. You were here because you thought Tom might come for me. When he met me that evening to show the photos, he only had 2 magazines with 4 photos. He didn't know about my other photos that were in that mailing you and the girls have received. All the magazines and calendars I've ever been published in, Tom didn't have them all. I'm absolutely certain of that. The director just told me that the testimony of a woman named Marcy Milko will be evidence against Tom. The only Milko I've ever heard of is some guy you recently hired but whom I've never met. The only time Tom and I discussed this was at the Dewdrop that time. Now I recall the odd couple in the adjacent booth that evening.
What are you hiding from me, Bill? Paula demanded.
I hoped Paula would never connect all the dots. She was too smart to be deceived. I had no choice but to throw myself at her mercy.
Paula, Jure note only von leaving with a secret altese ears.
Please listen and try to understand. I had just finished trade school and was working at my first job. As was customary then, the guys always plastered the shop with pictures of women. They stuck them on their toolboxes and just about everything else they could find. You were one of those models. I couldn't stop looking at you. I started buying all those magazines, looking for more of your pictures and reading everything I could about you. In one of them, I found out you were attending a big state college out east. Sadly, I started driving to the state capital on weekends, hoping your college was there and that I'd see you in person. There was no real reason to even think it was the college you were attending, or even that you were in college at all, I confessed. I had these thoughts that I'd find you and an hour later you'd be in my arms. Unbelievably, I found you after a football game. Remember, it was your senior year, and you had stopped modeling, or whatever you call it.
Do you remember?
It took me 2 whole years to finally hold you.
I was head over heels in love with you long before that.
I knew the school was closed the night you said you had to go back, but you were actually meeting man. My new guy at work kept an eye on you, and luckily he brought his wife Marcy. They heard everything and told me. I sent those photos to the girls and myself to get you to stop being afraid, and to send man away. Those photos were from my personal stash. On Saturday, I drove Marcy to the manager and told her the whole story. I knew if man tried to show her those photos, it would be the final straw and she'd fire him. I was afraid he might try to retaliate against you afterward, so I stayed close to keep an eye on you, I explained. Why didn't you ever tell me you knew about those photos when we met, or ever after, Bill?
Paula asked.
I was afraid you'd think I was weird, and technically I was. I was afraid that someday you'd find out I spent 8 months looking for you at Pennsylvania College and think I was nuts, I admitted. I just love you so much. Paula, didn't you risk showing those photos to the girls, Bill? Didn't you realize it could make them hate me? Paula inquired. No, it never even crossed my mind. I made sure I was there when they looked at them.
I knetheit never hatte you.
I also figured they'd study my reaction to those photos and use it as a guide. Your girls could never hate you, and neither I nor anyone else could make them. Their reaction was as you saw it. They have a wonderful mother, and I have a fantastic wife. I'll be happy to hear you tell the rest of the story to the girls tonight, Bill Paula stated briskly.
Te know my secret, and now you'll tell them yours, so we don't live in fear anymore.
I hope you won't scare them off.